Chapter 15, The Victory. Smuts precipitated the final contest by announcing in the House of Assembly that the Europeans of Natal, who were the original employers of Indian contract labor, would not permit the lifting of the £3 annual tax on ex-serfs. That was the signal for the renewal of civil disobedience. Indentured laborers and former indentured laborers considered this a breach of the promise given to Professor Gokul. They volunteered en masse for Satyagraha. Gandhi closed Tolstoy Farm. Kasturbai, Gandhi, the Gandhi children and several others moved to Phoenix Farm. Adults prepared to go to prison. There were two issues, the tax and the ban on Asiatic immigrants. Presently, a third was added. On March 14, 1913, a justice of the Cape Colony Supreme Court ruled that only Christian marriages were legal in South Africa. This invalidated Hindu, Muslim, or Parsi marriages and turned all Indian wives into concubines without rights. For the first time, large numbers of women joined the resistors. Kasturbai also joined. As the opening move in the new campaign, a group of women volunteers were to cross from the Transvaal into Natal and thereby court arrest. If the border police ignored them, they would proceed to the Natal coalfield at Newcastle and urge the indentured miners to go on strike. Simultaneously, a chosen handful of Natal sisters, as Gandhi called them, would invite arrest by entering the Transvaal without permission. The Natal sisters were arrested and imprisoned. Indignation flared and brought new recruits. The Transvaal sisters were not arrested. They went to Newcastle and persuaded the Indian workers to put down their tools. Then the government arrested these women, too, and lodged them in jail for 3 months. As a result, the miners' strike spread. Gandhi hurried from Phoenix Farm to Newcastle. The miners lived in company houses. The company turned off their light and water. Gandhi believed the strike would last and therefore counseled the indentured laborers to leave their compounds, taking their blankets and some clothes, and pitch camp outside the home of Mr. and Mrs. D.M. Lazarus, a Christian couple from India, who had invited Gandhi to stay with them despite the risks such hospitality entailed. The strikers slept under the sky. Newcastle Indian merchants contributed food and cooking and eating utensils. Before long, 5,000 strikers had assembled within sight of the Lazarus house. Gandhi was astonished and baffled. What could he do with this multitude? They might be on his hands for months. He decided to see them safely deposited in jail in the Transvaal. He informed them of this prospect, described prison at its blackest, and urged waverers to return to the mines. None did. It was then agreed that on a fixed day they would all march the 36 miles from Newcastle to Charlestown, on the Natal Transvaal border, walk into the Transvaal and thereby earn jail sentences. A few women with children and disabled men were to travel by rail towards the same goal. While plans were being made, more strikers arrived. Again Gandhi attempted, without success, to dissuade them from following him. Accordingly, October 13th was set as the day of departure from Newcastle. He was able to furnish each soldier with 1.5 pounds of bread and an ounce of sugar. Instructions were, conduct yourselves morally, hygienically and pacifically. Submit to police flogging and abuse. Do not resist arrest. Charlestown was reached without incident. Preparations to receive the Gandhi army had been made in advance by Kallenbach and others. The Indian merchants of Charlestown, normal population 1,000, contributed rice, vegetables, kitchen equipment, etc. Gandhi was chef and head waiter. Complaints about inadequate portions were met with an infectious smile and a report on the total amount of food available and the amount of each person's equal ration. Women and children were accommodated in houses. The men slept in the grounds of the local mosque. Before moving on, Gandhi communicated his intentions to the government. He and his people were coming into the Transvaal to demonstrate against the breach of the Buddhist Mutes pledge and to assert their self-respect. I cannot conceive a greater loss to a man than the loss of his self-respect. Of course, he added, the Natal government could arrest them in Charlestown and thus spare them further treks. On the other hand, If the government annulled the £3 tax, the strikers would resume the mining of coal. The government did not oblige by arresting them at Charlestown, nor did it eliminate the £3 levy. In fact, Gandhi suspected that the authorities might not stop the army even if it penetrated into the Transvaal. In that case, he contemplated advancing on Tolstoy Farm by 8-day marches of 20 miles each. How would he feed his peace troops on the road for 8 days? A European baker at Volksrust, the Transvaal border town, undertook to supply them in Volksrust and then to ship the necessary quantity of bread by rail each day to an appointed spot en route to the farm. Gandhi counted his forces. There were 2,037 men, 127 women and 57 children. At 6:30 on the morning of November 6, 1913, Gandhi recalls, "We offered prayers and commenced the march in the name of God. From Charlestown on the natal side to Volksrust is 1 mile. A large detachment of Transvaal mounted border guards was on emergency duty. 2 days earlier the Volksrustlites had held a meeting at which several speakers declared they personally would shoot any Indian who attempted to enter the Transvaal. Kallenbach, who intended to defend the Indians, was challenged to a duel. He was a pupil of the great Sandow, and an accomplished pugilist and wrestler, but the Gandhian German arose and said, 'As I have accepted the religion of peace, I may not accept the challenge. The Indians do not want what you imagine. The Indians are not out to challenge your position as rulers. They do not wish to fight with you or to fill the country. They propose to enter the Transvaal not with a view to settle there, but only as an effective demonstration against the unjust tax which is levied upon them. They are brave men. They will not injure you in person or in property, they will not fight with you, but enter the Transvaal they will, even in the face of your gunfire. They are not the men to beat a retreat from the fear of your bullets or spears. They propose to melt, and I know they will melt, your hearts by self-suffering. Nobody shot anybody. Perhaps Kallenbach's speech turned away the white wrath. Perhaps the police reinforcements at the border sobered the hotheads. The guards let the Indians pass. The first halt was made at Palmford, 8 miles beyond Volksrust. The marchers ate the meager meal and stretched out on the earth for sleep. Gandhi had surveyed his slumbering resistors and was about to lie down when he heard steps and a moment later saw a policeman approaching, lantern in hand. "I have a warrant to arrest you," the officer said politely to Gandhi. "I want to arrest you." "When?" Gandhi asked. "Now," the policeman replied. "Where will you take me?" "To the adjoining station first," the officer explained democratically, "and to Volksrust when there is a train." Gandhi woke Mr. P.K. Naidu, a faithful lieutenant, and gave him instructions for continuing the march to Tolstoy Farm. Gandhi was transported to Volksrust and arraigned in court. The prosecutor demanded imprisonment, but the judge released Gandhi on bail furnished by Kallenbach. Gandhi had asked for release on bail because of his responsibilities to the marchers. Kallenbach, stationed in Volksrust to send on stragglers and new recruits, had a car ready and quickly drove Gandhi back to the Indian Army. The next day the Indians halted at Standerton. Gandhi was handing out bread and marmalade when a magistrate stepped up and said to Gandhi, "You are my prisoner." "It seems I have been promoted," Gandhi commented with a laugh, "since magistrates take the trouble to arrest me instead of mere police officials." Again Gandhi was freed on bail. 5 co-workers were imprisoned. 2 days later, November 9th, as Gandhi and Pollock were walking at the head of the long column, a card came up and the officer had ordered Gandhi to go with him. Gandhi passed the command to Pollock. The officer permitted Gandhi to inform the marchers of his arrest, but when the little general began to exhort the Indians to remain peaceful, the officer exclaimed, "You are now a prisoner and cannot make any speeches." In 4 days, Gandhi had been arrested 3 times. The march continued without the leader. On the morning of the 10th, on reaching Balfour, the Indians saw 3 special trains drawn up at the station to deport them to Transvaal to Natal. At first they refused to submit to arrest, and it was only through the cooperation of Pollock, Ahmed Kakalia and others that the police were able to herd the marchers into the trains. Pollock was thanked for his services and arrested and confined in Volksrust jail. There he found Kallenbach. On November 14th, Gandhi was brought to trial in Volksrust. He pleaded guilty. The court, however, would not convict a prisoner, Gandhi wrote, merely upon his pleading guilty. It therefore requested him to supply the witnesses against himself, and Gandhi did so. Kallenbach and Pollock testified against him. 24 hours later, Gandhi appeared as a witness against Kallenbach, and 2 days after that, Gandhi and Kallenbach testified against Pollock. Judge Theodore Just reluctantly gave each of them 3 months hard labor in the Volksrust prison. Fresh prisoners kept Gandhi informed on Satyagraha developments outside. The arrest of the leaders and marchers had stirred new enthusiasm, and the number of resistors throughout South Africa mounted fast. Occasionally, Gandhi could send messages to followers still at liberty. Meanwhile, Gandhi rejoiced in congenial company. This was too much of a good thing, and the government shifted him to Bloemfontein, where he was with Europeans and Negroes, but no Indians. The striking miners met a worse fate. Trains carried them back to the mines, where they were forced into wire-enclosed stockades and placed under company employees who had been sworn in as special constables. Despite whips, sticks and kicks, they refused to descend to the coalface. News of these events was cabled to India and England. India seethed with resentment. The authorities grew alarmed. Lord Hardinge, the British Viceroy, was impelled to deliver a strong speech at Madras in which, breaking precedent, he trenchantly criticized the South African government and demanded a commission of inquiry. Meanwhile, more indentured laborers left their work in sympathy with the rebellious Newcastle miners. The state regarded such laborers as slaves without the right to strike, and sent soldiers to suppress them. In one place some were killed and several wounded. The tide of resistance rose higher. Approximately 50,000 indentured laborers were on strike. Several thousand free Indians were in prison. From India came a stream of gold. At a meeting in Lahore, in the Punjab, a Christian missionary named Charles F. Andrews gave all the money he had to the South African movement. Others made similar sacrifices. By arrangement, several leading Indians in Albert West, who edited Indian Opinion, and Sonia Schlesson, Gandhi's secretary, avoided arrest to conduct propaganda, handle finances, and communicate with India and England. The government nevertheless arrested Mr. West. Thereupon, Gokul sent Andrews from India to replace him. He came with W. W. Pearson, another high-minded Englishman. Cables between the Viceroy's office and London and between London and South Africa hummed with voluminous official messages. Unexpectedly, the government liberated Gandhi, Kallenbach and Pollock on December 18, 1913. All three of us, Gandhi writes, were disappointed upon our release. Civil disobedience, properly launched and inspired, needed no leaders. If Gandhi wanted to be free, he need not have gone to jail at all. He could have refrained from opposing the government. Going into and coming out of prison had to advance the cause, and this time coming out did not. Under pressure from the Viceroy and the British authorities in Whitehall, a commission had been appointed to investigate the grievances of the Indians in South Africa, and it was hoped that the release of Gandhi and his colleagues would testify to the bona fides of Botha and Smuts in appointing it. But upon regaining his liberty, Gandhi asserted in a public Hardinge, the British Viceroy, was impelled to deliver a strong speech at Madras in which, breaking precedent, he trenchantly criticized the South African government and demanded a commission of inquiry. Meanwhile, more indentured laborers left their work in sympathy with the rebellious Newcastle miners. The state regarded such laborers as slaves without the right to strike, and sent soldiers to suppress them. In one place some were killed and several wounded.